Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings. In this episode, I am joined by Debbie-Ann Chambers, my colleague at the University of the West Indies, for a conversation on narrative, autoethnography, and story as Caribbean ways of knowing. This is not a discussion about storytelling as illustration. It is a conversation that treats story as method, as theory, and as a form of intellectual labor that carries memory, risk, and responsibility. Together, we reflect on what it means to place the self into research. Debbie-Ann speaks with honesty about vulnerability in autoethnographic work, about the tension between authority and exposure, and about the parts of ourselves that do not always appear tidy, resolved, or theoretically coherent. She shares moments where silence became instruction, where listening required attentiveness to safety and history, and where drumming opened pathways into embodied learning and self-understanding. Through this episode, we return to a central question that sits at the heart of Caribbean scholarship. What do we lose when we dismiss story? And what becomes possible when we trust it as a legitimate way of knowing?
Is there a story or remembered moment that has stayed with you and continues to shape how you think, write, and teach?
That's a wonderful question. Is there a story? I would say yes. It isn't particular like one story, but it's a theme from my teenage life. So I have a deep interest in social class and of course social class in my field in particular. But I think if I'm going to be honest, my interest comes from my experience as a preteen and teen, moving from a sugar estate in St. Catherine, where the parents are grew up on a sugar estate, to Kingston, being a student at Campion College. And it was an interesting social class experience because I lived on a sugar estate where my father was general manager. So everybody knew him as Mas Herman and everybody knew us. But then when we moved to Kingston, of course, I was a girl from the country. I took the bus in the city and all of that. And the sort of shape shifting that happened in people's relationship with me and in my understanding of myself has impacted me to this day. And I think that I spent quite a bit of my PhD studies kind of investigating that and recognizing that social class is a lot more than just about money. It's about social location and all of that stuff. So I would say that is one of the stories that has shaped my life for sure.
Place to start.
Yeah.
I feel like your reasoning could just be that, because when I think about a sugar estate is filled with stories for me. There's so many stories connected just to our history in the Caribbean as a plantation economy. In some ways we still are, but that's another conversation. But that history, and then there is the town to country to town history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
What does that story ask of you when you return to it?
I think it asks a few things. As I'm listening to my body, what I hear myself saying is it asks me to be a voice. I think Jamaica is a very classist society. And unfortunately, we don't investigate social class enough or talk about the experience of class in our day to day. Even working at the university, in my job as a therapist, it's important for me to have a conversation about people's social vocation. So sometimes I will ask questions that maybe for the first time students are really hearing and get an opportunity to just talk about their class experiences. So it asks that of me. I think too, another question, this may be very personal and sometimes it's very difficult for me. It asks me who I am and how I am situated in society in my day to day, right? I sometimes, so I will say, okay, you have working class, middle class, upper middle class, owning class, things like that. And I understand that as Dr. Chambers, Debian Chambers, PhD, living in the area of Kingston that I do and having access to quite a bit of privilege, I probably am upper middle class. But you can even notice my voice as I say it. It has a physical, I'm really not too sure. Because culturally, I don't feel like I'm situated in circles of the upper middle class. But it also asked me to investigate that for myself and how I hold my privilege and what that's about. So I don't think I have an answer to that. But yeah.
How has story been part of your academic life?
Story has been a huge part of my academic life. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of the West Indies in Mona. And one of the lecturers that I remember the most is Clement Branch. I studied social psychology with him, and he was very much into stories. The idea that to understand Jamaicans, he used to say you have to sit down under a tree and talk with them. And he taught using stories. I remember some of his stories. He talked about relationships using his own relationship at the time, and he would tell funny stories and things like that. So I developed a keen appreciation for social psychology and just the curiosity of listening to people's stories to overstand, let's say. And I could go on, but in my master's program, I met Alicia Ali, a woman of Trinidadian background who lived in Canada and migrated to the US. So I did my master's in the US. And Alicia is a feminist scholar, and we kind of sought to understand. She taught me about the idea of emancipation versus empowerment. And understand, and we looked at issues of poverty and social class also, but we did a lot of interviewing of people in what's considered poverty reduction programs and understanding the concept of emancipation through their eyes and through their lens rather than what a pre-done scale, a quantitative scale would say, but really listening to people's stories to understand and appreciation for that. She also introduced me to the idea of women silencing of themselves, right? Women have, all genders have stories, but if I just talk about women right now, women have a lot of stories in relationships. And so I developed an appreciation for that and the silencing of self and how that evolved. And then when I did the PhD, I was privileged to meet Laura Smith, who was my advisor. And Laura studied social class in psychotherapy. So there was, again, that theme weaving throughout my academic life. And Laura was the one who introduced me to participatory action research. And that was really, I guess, the fire, maybe stoking my own liberation. Introduced me to the works of Ignacio Martin Barro in participatory action research, how stories unfold and how the story of the researcher, how that is intertwined with the story of the participant, and how we can co-create stories together, And that was very, very, very powerful for me. The importance of walking side by side with the people who I asked to share their stories with me. So she was very much into the idea that my liberation cannot happen without the liberation of others. And so delved very much into participatory action research projects. And my own dissertation was qualitative. So it was called Coping with Unemployment and Poverty. And again, that was about going into shelters and community agencies and listening to the stories of people's lived experience with chronic unemployment, which was just very eye-opening and very touching for me. There are some people I can see in front of my face, as I talk about it. One man, for example, who shared with a good amount of pain in his voice what it was like to be a father who did not have financial means and how he was discredited in his own fatherhood, even though he wanted to spend time with his children. But that wasn't enough because to be a man meant you had to have money to give. And I've never, never, never forgotten that. So they have been my teachers, as I continue to do this work. And then just going on in, after graduation, continuing to do qualitative research and autoethnography. So that's when I met Professor Freddie Hickling, who was a master storyteller and poet himself. And he taught me cultural therapy. And cultural therapy, again, was about listening to people's stories with the unique twist of, I used to often be a scribe in his reasoning circles, and the scribe would listen to the stories and write a poem. So, that's been my world of like poetry therapy and cultural therapy. So again, gosh, just talking about, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. It has been a big part of my life. Yeah. So that's my academic life. Right now, I am working with two persons, Nicole D'Souza and Hethora, and we're looking at, Afro-Caribbean indigenous methods, which include storytelling, drumming, all of that, to do mental health first aid. I could also go into drumming as telling stories and what it's told me about myself. So I got to a drum circle with Jessie G. So I guess I'll go into the personal now. And my own exploration into drumming and dance. So I would say if I told you who I am right now, I'm a person coming to understand the body as a site of liberation. And how, to be very honest, I'm somebody who's in my high school experience, I really became disembodied. And the focus was more on what I could learn from books. So again, the country girl, Debbie, used to enter dance festivals during festival time and all of them something there. But coming to Kingston and going to secondary school, it was very much about books. So my relationship with dance, etc., was severed in high school. And I considered that in some ways I became disembodied. So now in my approaching late 40s, midish to late 40s, I am reclaiming the body through dance, drumming, and somatic therapies. So that's been a big, yeah.
There's so many gems. I'm tracking the trajectory from growing up in a sugar estate all the way into the arc of story, understanding story as a legitimate epistemology, as a legitimate form of knowing. There's so many branches, and I want us to just dig into some of them as well. When I think there's a moment you said, you're talking about participatory action research, and you said, that is when my liberation began. You said that, and I had a sensation in my body.
Yeah.
This is what I read as I was tracking you. At that point in time, there was this understanding that the participants were sharing a story, and that both as a researcher, as a person leading or facilitating the interview, your stories involved and your liberation are kind of tied together. And I want us to unpack that to really kind of understand what that means. A large segment of the audience for this reasoning is our students, graduates. And I want us to kind of unpack that. Like, what does it mean? That moment when you realize that my liberation is tied or connected to the liberation of the person I'm doing research with and not on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's wrapped up in just what you said, doing research with instead of on, right? And I can only talk about my experience, but there's something for me about doing research on where you go in with a hypothesis or preconceived notions and we're looking for something maybe on a scale, or you're not really participating with persons. And again, maybe I have a bias, I may name my and own it, right? But it's giving a scale to get data to then go into an office and analyze it and study it and come up with your ideas based on theories that are out there about what is happening. Doing research with calls me to be with people, literally. And the people that I was with, Laura would often remind us that they were our co-researchers. And so there was just as much legitimacy that they had that we had, and vice versa, right? So we were to own legitimacy of our own stories, our own voice, our own knowledge, and honor the legitimacy of others. And in the power work, we would do power with sometimes with teenagers, sometimes with adults. And when you open this shared space, whether it was circle or otherwise, the things that the teenagers, I guess you would say, no, would clock you on. You really had to kind of pause and stop and go, okay. And your question is not out of order, as we would say in Jamaica, you're not supposed to ask adults certain things, but your question was a legitimate research question that required attention. I remember it wasn't power, but I'll give an example. I used to also work at, no, that's a whole nother story. That's for another episode. So I used to work at Alpha Institute, and I remember I would use power principles in the classroom with the boys. So Alpha Institute is an institute for boys in Jamaica, often who did not make it through the traditional high school system. It shifted a bit since I've left. So often there were boys who had dropped out of school, sometimes for financial reasons, boys who were expelled from school, things like that. And they would be looking for other opportunities to learn a trade. Alpha is the site of Jamaican music and so on, yeah, etc. Some of the boys would go into music, some would go into woodwork, gardening, etc. And we had life skills classes where I would go in. I was the only psychologist at that point at Alpha. We did have social workers too. Once used to go do home visits with her. It's very much out in the community. So I would go into the classrooms. I used principles of power. And in one classroom, I was talking about critical hope, right? Which I guess some people would go, well, you talk about critical hope with these boys for them. No, nothing. But power was about honoring their knowledge. So yes, of course I would go. They probably know more than me. Actually, they did, about critical hope. So you don't go in with this bias that because the boys didn't, quote unquote, succeed in this traditional high school setting, that there were boys without knowledge. So I went in talking about critical hope and giving a definition of what it was and how it would look up. And there was this boy, we became good friends after a while. He just would give me this stare down. So after a while, I said, so what's going on? What's going on here? And him kiss him teeth after me. And him said to me, you ever see a man Mara shut out? And I stopped and I said, no. And the other boys got real quiet. And then him said, oh, okay. And then I said, why do you think I've never seen a man's Mara shut out? I live about 20 minutes from you. How is it that I can live to my age? And I've never seen that. And you've probably seen. And the boys got excited. Because you're uptown, miss. And then we had this whole conversation about class and how my living literally 20 minutes away in a country as small as Jamaica protected me from certain realities that he wasn't protected from. And whether that was fair, whether that was just, what does that say about Jamaica? So for me, that is what power is, right? In a traditional setting, sometimes you could say, oh, you're out of order. Why are you asking me that? You're challenging me as the teacher because I am the person who is the authority. And how dare you ask a question like that? Which is a kind of hiding, but rather that, hey, this is a problem that you've named. And we're going to the Freire problem posing to say, all right, what are the cultural things that have caused that to do that kind of reasoning? So I loved that about power.
I'm curious about what he told you about critical hope.
Gosh, I'm trying to remember now. I remember that snap from it. But I suppose, I think the boys were, maybe I would say that after the conversation, they saw themselves as agents of critical hope, even though it felt like at times that they could, life could be hopeless, because here they were at Alpha, regardless of what society said about them, they had not given up. And they had seen sometimes the worst, and they were still moving forward, and how their neighbors were still moving forward. So our stereotypes about what the inner city is not true. And how living in that kind of hope. I would say that because he became my good friend, I would say. He used to come to me for sessions after that. And we just talked about his reality, the things that he had survived and the dreams he had for his own self. And yeah, I guess how he was an agent of hope himself. And he taught me a lot. So, just very grateful.
Yeah. Like I'm seeing in that moment how that connection between his liberation and yours, even liberating you from the idea that because we live within 20 minutes of each other, we have a shared experience of the world. Um, and then how then that opens you up
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah,
reframe your questions.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to name my biases and, present them and my own experiences and to be okay with the idea of being transparent. Like I don't have to be blank slate as sometimes. I guess we move past that in psychology now, I hope. But that the way that I was maybe taught, although I had a lot of non-traditional teachers, as you've heard, but the way that traditional psychology has taught that there's no reason why healing comes from that epistemology
Yeah.
only.
So, I mean, I have lived in Jamaica now. This is my 7th year. Like just the way in which he phrased the question, you ever see a man married? And being from Trinidad and spending time in Grenada, in St. Lucia, I think all of the region, we have a way with story.
Yes.
There's a way that we put things together. And because
Yes.
I'm here, I'm really always like the fact that he will even ask the question, not have you ever seen a man killed, miss? But you
Mhm.
ever see a man married shut out?
Yes. Yes.
There's a way in which when we speak, imagery is just always alive. I
Yes.
hear it a lot when Jamaicans speak. The imagery is personified. It's not just a question. Like question
Mhm.
has a body.
Yes.
And the question itself is telling a story.
Yes. Isn't it? Yes. Yes. A very rich one at that.
Rich and very layered. So even when you say that thing about like they may have understood critical hope in a way that they hadn't thought of, but because the language is so rich and because it's so layered.
Yeah. You remind me, Prof. Hickling used to call it psychic centrality. He says when a group of people sit in a circle and share their stories, there is a truth that emerges in the back and forth, and he was, of course, very much influenced by Rastafari and reasoning circles. So he lived it and saw it and brought it into his own work.
Thanks for bringing that to the phone. And I feel as though, by just speaking his name, we're inviting him
Mhm.
and invoking him in this
Yeah.
conversation as well. So connected to that, I guess I want to ask, how do like lineage and place and community show up in the stories that we choose to tell, or the stories sometimes that we refuse to tell? You spoke about silences as well.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of times we talk about stories that are spoken, but there's stories that we refuse to tell, and that is also a story.
Yeah. Bringing out all the stories in me. So when you talk about lineage and communities and stories not being told, I think I've lived many lifetimes. So when I returned to Jamaica, I worked in West Kingston in Hannahtown for 2 years. So Hannahtown is not too far from Tivoli Gardens. And I returned in 2012, which was about, I think it was 2 years after the incursion in Tivoli, which was this really violent episode where Dudas was extradited. So a lot of people had their own traumatic stories about that experience, but it was layered and complicated. So one of the things that I did with the community, there was Sister Beverly, was Francisca's sister. She would have every week a food pantry. So she would give out parcels. One of the community, and people would sit around and wait till Sister Beverly come, open up the parcels. And one of the community members, actually, he was in some ways an elder from Tivoli Gardens, invited me to, say, hey, Debbie, we're sitting around waiting for the parcels. Why don't come and do something while we're waiting for the parcels? So I used to go and we used to sing songs. And then again, my influenced by Paula Freire and problem posing, I would bring a question to the group and we would talk about it. And there was one particular day that I went in and we would do our usual singing and dancing and moving. And I asked a question. Everybody was quiet. And I was like, why are we quiet today? And, I could have said, oh, people just not to it today. Maybe they're hungry, maybe they're whatever. But learning to ask questions said, y'all are quiet today, bringing up that question of what is not being said. And a few raised eyebrows, and they used to call me sister. They said, sister, the walls have ears and eyes. And so I said, what does that mean? And I asked this in my own, innocent way. And they talked about, the importance of knowing, I suppose, when gang warfare was near and people were always listening. And it was not always safe to share stories in public gathering in that time. So I learned a lot about the meaning of silence in the community and what silence meant. And there was a similar thing I had in a teenage group. We used to call it, what we used to call it again? Something like positive vibes or something like that. And there were quiet days, and usually there was, a lot of anxiety or jitteriness, and they would tell me stories about, hey, there are days here when you have to be quiet. And so in that sense, the silence had its own story of, maybe if you want to call it, trauma and survival, and the ways in which sometimes residents survive the violence by keeping stories to themselves or maybe speaking in codes, right? And no, if I were there, no, I would say maybe we would have spoken our stories through music, maybe Anansi's story. So those would have been deep codes about what's going on, but we're going to speak it in another way, invited that. I'm sure the residents would have loved that. But yeah. And then in my work, what's coming to me now, in my work at the university, and with women, to be honest, I think there's a lot of silence. I guess the body as a site of pillage, a lot of our women have survived sexual assault. A lot of women have survived sexual assault, and there's a lot of silence around it. People known to me in my personal life, and of course people that I work with. And, I'm curious to know, how that shows up somatically and how it teaches, again, women self-silencing, about how we silence ourselves and how those stories can be shared and told, maybe in codified ways too, through music and dancing and drumming and storytelling, the importance of expressing that. So maybe that will be my next project. I don't know. Yeah.
So I do largely qualitative work.
Mhm.
I definitely appreciate the powerful quantitative work in terms of giving us that snapshot and getting a sense of scope. But as we are talking about the stories we refuse to tell, I think
Mhm.
so often, if we don't include qualitative data, we get data that doesn't have a context.
Right.
We get data lifted from the silence.
Right.
So sometimes we then have these figures, and why they give us this snapshot, I think there's so much that's missed. There's so much in an interview. There's so much data in an interview, so much somatic data, so much activity that might lead you to ask another question and to be
Yes.
curious, probe, and so much of that is missed. And I think about that specifically when I data around gender.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much nuance and so much silence
Mm-hmm.
that quantitative methods as a standalone
Yeah.
can't access.
No, not at all. No. And that's also why I like autoethnography, right? Because there is knowledge that comes out of my own experience within a place that if, I sit with and again investigate honestly and open will bring forward something that I don't think can be captured quantitatively at all. So
So let's jump into autoethnography. No,
Mhm.
before we do that, you said something and you just touched on it, and I know we can't talk about all the things, but I jotted a couple of things down. So two of the
Sure.
things that I think I want to flag. One of them is that connection between disembodiment and colonial education, and those are my words,
It's my word too. I was being nice by not using it, but it's my word.
in which it teaches us to be disembodied.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so there is that, and I'm curious just about, you said in high school in particular, and I
Yeah.
wonder about, with so much pressure, do you have an opportunity to embody and be?
Yeah.
But this idea of disembodiment, and I wonder about how that prepares the students that we then meet in our classroom.
Mm-hmm.
When we are then saying,
Mm-hmm.
what's the emotional location?
Right.
Sense of this thing. Um, so I'm curious about how that comes up for you in the classroom. And I think that's another personal connecting with the professional. Does that come up in your classroom? It shows up in mine.
Yeah.
So classroom, and what is the tension that arises for you when it does?
Sure. For me, so most of my work now is doing therapy in wellness center. So it shows up all over the place in my therapy work in terms of asking questions about emotions. It's like I'm asking a foreign language most of the time. And and coming to understand that through experience of being disembodied. What do I mean? I'll give an example. So now I'm learning that, emotions themselves arise from the body. And when we are curious about the body and sensations and images and movements, we will hit upon emotions and a lot of other rich things, which is why I think the body is a site of liberation. But something that I will experience a lot when I sit with students, like sometimes they'll be talking about their lives, they'll start to shake their legs. And I'll say, oh, I noticed you shaky legs when you're talking about, oh, sorry. sorry, Doctor. Yeah. And I'll say, you're apologizing for shaking. I'm just, we're just noticing it together. Maybe that leg is saying something. Maybe that's comforting to you. But the way that I understand it, and in talking to the students in the classroom, if you are not perfectly sitting up straight and still, you're considered rude, disrespectful, out of order, you're not paying attention. So many of us learn to keep still. That's our bodies were naturally doing to comfort us, to say something to us was inappropriate, And it's sad because sometimes that shaking of the leg or that yawning or that rocking is what is going to help work through the anxiety, to actually help you to learn. So that's been a big, big, big thing. And yes, I teach a lot about emotions in my work. in terms of just naming them. And that usually, should I say usually? That sometimes leads to stories of how showing emotions was either unsafe at home, how an emotion like anger became scary because somebody did not want to become like their parent, grandparent who was often aggressive, or sometimes not even about abuse, as you know, but is like what was missing. So being with the anxious, overworked, overburdened, depressed parent who could not contain my emotions, you know? And so survival meant just numbing the emotions so that they wouldn't be quote unquote distressing to those around them. That was survival. So then here they land with me and I'm like, oh, how do you feel? Tell me. And they're like,
What's up with this?
yeah. So, and it's a long process in itself, but yeah.
You think that storytelling demands of the researcher that traditional academic approaches avoid?
That's a great question. Okay, if I think about myself, what does storytelling? Well, I know autoethnography requires of me to be vulnerable because I'm putting my story out there as knowledge. And if it is going to bring about knowledge, I have to be really vulnerable and really honest, and that will expose maybe parts of me that, you know, I'm coming to terms with myself or don't look very liberation, critical psychologies, feminist theories, it not always looks so pretty. And so it's kind of putting it out there. But, you know, to be honest, I've also learned that there's much appreciate love, as we say in Jamaica, for my ability to be vulnerable as a researcher. I've had situations where I've gone into there was one community mental health program I did too at McGill, and it was just me telling my story. It was storytelling with pictures and so on about my experience. And I had several people come up to me afterwards and said they'd never seen a presentation like that and how it made them feel seen. But for me, it was very important not to go off on a tangent, but because honestly, after I graduated, I went through a period where I wanted to like burn up a lot of my books because psychology has a way of, they'll give you a case in a book. Then the therapist will say, ask a question, and all of a sudden, all these things unfold. And here I was in West Kingston, asked the very same question. The people them tell me to ask, and it was not the same one. And it was just, right? So I wanted to share my experience because I wanted to say to young people graduating, studying, hey, it's all right. I've been through it too. And this is part of the process and we don't talk about it. So if nobody and I go talk about it, I might as well talk about it and share it with you. So yeah. So that was my roundabout way of answering the question.
Is there tension for you between vulnerability and authority? And I say that especially in our context because we operate in, and this may be so for other countries. I think vulnerability and autoethnography is well written about and it's out there. I think for us in our very post-colonial institution, um, said it. So in our post-colonial institution, and I say this unapologetically, like I think we are living in the afterlife of slavery. It is what it is. There is a way in which authority mocks you. And then autoethnography requires you to be vulnerable. So I know there's a tension for me, and sometimes I struggle with being vulnerable, but needing to be the authority. And I wonder if that comes up for you and how it has manifested for you.
Yeah, let me think about that. Mm. I would say yes. No, actually, yes. It's a strong yes. It's not a maybe yes. It's a strong yes. Sometimes when I do the things that I do, whether it's speaking about my own life in scholarship or being self-disclosing in sessions, talking about my own internalized colonialism and stuff with people. Sometimes I feel like there are the ghosts of my training behind me, and I'm gonna be exposed, and somebody's going to say, you don't have credibility as a psychologist, because you're not doing what the field says you're supposed to be doing. Yeah. So to be honest, especially returning home after, you just newly minted PhD, and people had a way of people had a way of coming up to me and saying, you probably already know this. And they would say something like, no. But they feel like you would say, oh, yes, I've heard about that. I'm like, no, 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 no. So very much in the beginning and even now sometimes, yes, for sure, 100%. I think where I am now, though, what is emerging, if I can be frank, is a tiredness. I'm not gonna survive this for much longer if I'm not authentic. And I could get into another story now, but if
The story,
indeed,
the story.
so I've developed an interest in EFA, right? And if indeed, which I believe, that we have a purpose here and our journey or prayers or desire is to be in alignment with our purpose, then it requires my vulnerability. At the end, what do I benefit? And I know that's easier said than done, but I just come to a point where I can't fight these systems anymore. There was definitely a aha moment. It was actually during COVID, as you mentioned, COVID. And I had read this interview, cannot remember the woman now, but an interview of a indigenous North American woman. And the interviewer asked her, doesn't she get tired with fighting the systems? And she says she no longer fights the systems because they can't be fought and dismantled. Her vision is always on what she needs to do, and she recognizes that's often on the outliers of the system. So that was a huge, oh, okay, Debbie, stop fight. And you may not be recognized as an authority in some places. And yes, it's a good on you because your parents spend how much money giving you this Ivy League PhD or whatever. But that's not where my purpose is, Yeah. So it's how do I want to live?
You mentioned IFA,
Yeah.
and if you're comfortable in
Yeah.
exploring this. And I'm curious about how spirituality is also integrated with your work as an autoethnography. And for like the students who are watching, the people who are watching who are not familiar with the IFA tradition and what that means, if you could just kind of speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So as I'm coming to study and learn more about IFA myself, it's an understanding of the place of ancestors in our life, the help of ancestors, or connection with ancestors. In my work, I would also say the possibility of ancestral healing through our own lives and the role that our ancestors have in moving us towards healing if we are open to connecting with them. So that's a big part of IFA. Another part of IFA is the understanding of something called your Ori, which is if you want to say your personal Orisha, I'm going to use that language. If there's any IFA priestess or Babalawa, they might be like, no, that's okay. The idea that you chose a purpose and a mission of this earth, and our journey is to reconnect with that. And we do that through honoring or Ori. Maybe what some would call now is your higher self. So using that language, connecting with your higher self through meditation and prayers and so on to be in alignment. And then, of course, there are the Orishas who I understand or I'm coming to understand as not only emanations of source, but orishas also represent the various energies in nature, and they represent our own energies. So sometimes I think orishas, thinking about like Shango and Oya and Oshun and Yimoya, they represent different facets of our reality. And I believe the orishas that you are attracted to at a certain point in life telling you something about yourself. There is a Vodun priestess, Aline there, who's also a psychologist, who talks about the Orisha as or archetypes. And she said, who are you attracted to? That's you, Yeah, so no, people, so no, I really, okay. So you see, I was just talking about vulnerability. I'm really being vulnerable here because I said, I'm going to throw me out. No, but, but that's okay. Yeah, I have to walk the talk. So how do I incorporate that into my work? And I'm very saddened by the way that we see anything having to do with African spirituality as demonic. I'm very saddened by that because my experience growing up in the Christian church, and I was very heavily involved in the church, right? My study of African spirituality has actually helped me understand some deep philosophies of Christianity. So I don't see that as this big separation, but okay. How I bring that in probably nowadays personally, by connecting with my own ancestors and asking for wisdom and courage to do the work that I've been given to do. These days, also questioning whether the work I do is in line with my deeper purpose, which I think a big part of it is living, walking, and practicing or Afro-Caribbean indigenous practices. So sometimes I look at the disconnect and say, hey, maybe what's going on? And then for the people that I work with, especially the students, your worth is more than your grades. And I have that in my head, like, what is your purpose? I was sitting with a student recently. Of course, I can't share a whole lot, but this happens a lot in the faculty I'm in. Quote unquote, bright students are put into the sciences. See how I rub in my head just thinking of it. And as I listened, I said, you sound like a poet as you're talking. Oh, I love poetry, creativity. And I said, so what you do? Yes. And sort of, I use a lot of humor, but then it's like, no, this isn't. And I've seen a few of my students, their eyes just open up and we talk about colonial education and value in our society and class. And I've had one of the students come to the realization they're not where they're supposed to be. And they move elsewhere, which to me, according to IFA, if our greatest purpose is to be in alignment with our mission, that is deep, meaningful work to me.
Makes perfect sense for me.
Hmm.
And I understand Ori as, your head.
Yes.
And so it's kind of interesting too, because we were talking about being researchers, being involved in academia, which is a very heady thing. It's all about leading with cognition. But the idea that the Ori, the energies that guide your head, that guides your purpose, and how that
Yes.
should be guided thinking and the interrelation between the two. I think that's
Yes.
a really powerful image.
I'm so an Orisha that I just think is hilarious and love is Eshu or Elegba. And you love it. And one of the, the meditations is to, however Eshu appears in your life, which is usually through mischief and a little bit of chaos, it is align me with the choices that are going to move me in the direction of my purpose, and that has been important to me because we know there can be a lot of chaos in certain institutions, and the call for me now is to, to ground myself and say, okay, how can this align me with my greater purpose? After I come out of my feeling and I done course and I done say, yeah, today I'm going to resign. I don't know. Just to sit down and, it's in meditation and go, okay, how can this align with my greater purpose? And I've recognized that some moves I've made at the university have been in service of my greater purpose. And so it's okay. So I can accept it. Yeah.
As you say that too, I'm reminded that but it's also the energy of the crossroads as well, right?
Yeah.
Standing on the crossroads. And when I think about going into autoethnography, going into narrative ethnography, these things which are as far away from positivist approaches to research, it feels like a crossroad moment when you decide, you know what, this is the path that I'm going to take. So is there a particular text or a moment of reception or reflection that really changed how you understood your responsibility as a storyteller?
Well, I can think of Professor Hickling's texts. He wrote in stories, really, come to think about it now. And sometimes you'd be reading and you realize it didn't always fall into the model of what, academia said it's supposed to have, this linear thing. His texts were really chapters of stories. And so there's one titled Owning or Madness. And that was quite influential for me in terms of the stories that were in it, his own personal stories, his work, I think in Australia and elsewhere, his work in the Garden Theatre of Bellevue. And I guess it really freed me up to say, yeah, I can share my stories too. So that's a big part of that.
Like, even when I think about his energy and when I've seen him, it reminds me that stories are disruptive.
Yes,
They
yes,
they are disruptive, and
yes,
that narrative has a mandate to disrupt performance,
yes.
to disrupt the status quo, and to push you into embodiment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well said. Yes, very much so. And I'm smiling. I'm just thinking of his booming voice and laugh as he would tell stories to kind of wake you up and shock you. But yeah. Yeah.
So memory work seems to be a part of, well, let me not make this assumption. Like, even as we're having this reasoning and then you're going back and like, even there are points in time where you go, and I read it as searching for the implicit memory, right? You go, you're looking for it, you're going back into it. So I'm asking, has memory work been um a important part of your work, and how has it led you to new truths? Huh?
Well, that's a good question. It's a huge part of my work. It's the sharing of memory, really. That's what I do when I sit with people. Although the sharing of bodily sensations and, being curious about parts of themselves. Yeah, but also memory and how it shows up in poetry, because I do some poetry therapy work. And then, if I'm honest, the deeper I go into this work of somatic healing and sitting and listening with people's stories, which I guess that's what you're picking up on, the more I go back into my own story and reflect differently on things that have happened to me, in me, around me. And what's been really nice is that, out of my reflection, sometimes I go and my mother is still alive and I will ask my mother questions and then she'll share stories that then helps you go, stories of my grandmother, of my great grandmother, things like that. So I learn about things that have been passed on my maternal side for sure. And my paternal side too. Um, this is coming up in my head. So, and I feel like you're weaving together the things that I'm sharing. So another thing I do a lot of things, is, I don't do this as much, but, it's plant medicine work. Um, mhm, psilocybin. And my experience of psilocybin, funnily enough, is that it will unlock ancestral stories. Is just amazing how stories live within us that are on this deep biological, physiological level, and it exists within us and in the right conditions can be unlocked. We hold a lot of stories. Yeah, yeah, a lot of power.
So that's a whole other
That's a whole other. Mhm.
That's a whole other realm.
Mhm.
Coming back to this idea of the story would be liberating,
Mhm.
and the way in which it just kind of eradicates that divide between the therapist and the client,
Yeah.
the lecturer and the student,
Yeah.
holder of knowledge and the ones that we think we're giving knowledge to. Like it
Yeah.
is constantly just removing those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so.
Helpful. So maybe now is a good time to jump into, you brought up drumming and storytelling. How
Mhm.
is drumming in your story work?
I'm laughing at myself. So I'm learning drumming and I'm laughing because I'm constantly laughing in drum circles.
Okay.
Listen, drumming is a skill, I don't know, this idea that our ancestors were backward. If you think of that theoretically and you want to challenge it, just go to a drum circle. The science and math and connection to body and rhythm and pattern that is needed in drumming is just amazing to me. So as I'm learning it, I'm learning things about my own self, my own relationship to my body. So I shout out to Jesse G on Instagram. So I go to his drum circle. And what Jesse does, also Mambi at Preston, big up to Mambi at Preston Hall, who's a drummer, who also helps me with drumming. What Jesse does in his drum circle, sometimes not, sometimes all the time, introduces call and response. And so we learn basically the songs of our ancestors or folk songs and things like that. And it can be a beautiful reasoning about our history, because there's a lot in those folk songs. It's speaking a lot about relationships and politics and history and grief and joy and all of that. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, sort of connecting with that aspect. So that's in and of itself, like story through music and singing, really, really, really important. So of course we're creating stories together as we drums. Yeah. And I'm learning it.
Now, I was also thinking and unlocking stories somatically as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That you
Yeah.
can't put words to because it exists in the body and
Yeah.
it manifests in the song and the combination and the rhythms and the
Yeah.
beats, and
Yeah.
letting that
Yeah.
be a puzzle to
Yeah.
narrative.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so in terms of what it unlocks. I think there's only one time I've missed a drum circle, and it was actually after Hurricane Melissa, and I was holding community space, and I just woke up one morning, I was just crying, and
Yeah.
I said, "Yeah, I can't go near the drums today," because the drums are going to speak to me on a very deep level. And I didn't know at that point whether I had the capacity to hold that. Of course, what is often said in drum circles, Jesse, is that, all of you is welcome and the circle can hold everything. So I think, no, I would have probably go. But yeah, it's just the way the drums speak to you, about your connection to yourself and the kind of, we talk about vulnerability and calling you out of yourself, like to hit a drum with power, kind of, to me at least, this is the way that I think of it. It challenges these notions of like, let's be like the nice girl, which a lot of us are grown up. They say, hit the drum, it's all right. You can hit the drum, and you have to like question, yeah, these ideas of what it means to be good and nice and sweet and feminine, or, yeah. Which is funny because the drum circle is full of women though, so.
It's I'm laughing because we recently had a reasoning with Adiola Lewis, who uses mask and story and memory work, and she talks about carnival helping her to deal with or call forth all of those things she's been taught about being a good girl. And she talks
Yes.
about the unruliness of Juve, for instance,
Yes.
and how it's a little bit dangerous, it's on the edge. And so you said, beat the drum, hit the drum. And
Yeah.
I how it's continually disrupting performance and into authenticity and power as well.
Mm-hmm.
It looks pretty
Mm-hmm.
easy until you pick it up. And you go,
Mm-hmm.
how are you making that sound? Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. You know? Yeah. Actually, we have a psychologist at U too, Chukwemeka Chiano, from Nigeria living in Jamaica. And so he also does drum circles on campus. And when he does the drum circles, the students don't want to leave, just the ability to just move in rhythm and in community with each other. Importance of coming as you are and the drums responding to you and you responding to the drums is quite powerful.
Loving all the twists and turns of this reasoning. Still grounded in autoethnography and story making, but it's gone into drumming and spirituality. And what does it mean to show up to do your work with all of
Yes.
you? I think that's the thing that I'm like holding on my spirit.
Mm.
What does that mean to show up to do this work with all of you? And I'm going to include links to some of your work. And I recently read Autoethnography that you did. It the idea of showing up with all
Mhm.
of you and making decisions to show some parts because what you
Yeah.
don't show is also important and the
Yeah.
agency to do that.
Mhm.
I love that. I love that we have gone all over the place with it.
Uh-huh.
What are your hopes and dreams as you continue to do this work? This work, you said you're going into, you have a couple more decades.
Mhm.
Really exercise your choice to be in this space. Like, what is your dream for autoethnography as a research method in a Caribbean context?
Yeah. Yeah. I think my dream is that it will be even more deeply embraced by the young people coming up, and they're not so young, but definitely embraced as a valid way of knowing, a way that we can honor all the richness and stories within ourselves as an indicator of the shared stories we have with us. I think it's powerful. We are a storytelling nation, and I think by embracing autoethnography, we're embracing ourselves and our cultural strengths and resiliences. And I can just imagine how far it would go. That idea and ethos of aligning with your purpose, I think we'll be in more alignment with who we are, which can only be a powerful thing. So, yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place for us to close, which can
Thank
only
you.
be a powerful thing. Thank you for sharing so generously and just moving with the rhythm of this reasoning.
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful questions. So you enabled me to share. So I just much appreciative to you.
I love the appreciate.
As we come to a close of this conversation, Debian Chambers leaves us with a vision of autoethnography that is deeply Caribbean, deeply ethical, and deeply attentive to context. Across this episode, we have explored story as vulnerability, silence as knowledge, and the body as an archive of learning. We have considered what it means to honor narrative without extracting it, to listen without demanding disclosure, and to write from lived experience without turning the self into spectacle. This conversation reminds us that narrative work is not simply about speaking, it is about discernment, about recognizing when silence is protective, when laughter holds learning, and when embodied practices, such as drumming, carry intellectual weight that conventional research language often fails to name. From our shared location at the University of the West Indies, this episode affirms that Caribbean knowledge does not sit at the margins of scholarship. It is rigorous, generative, and already theorizing itself from story, memory, and relation. To learn more about Debian's work, visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Thank you for listening. Until next time.